Good evening. It is good to see everyone come back out this evening. We are continuing for at least a couple more weeks before we get into something else, a background history type class of things that will help us understand, especially the New Testament, a lot better in terms of culture, in terms of history, in terms of a lot of different things that are going on at this time. We looked last week, if you remember, at basically at what people would be reading, what Jews specifically would be reading or being told about, since a lot of them couldn't read themselves, having read to them, being told about what someone else read during the time of, well, before, and especially right before Christ, those 200 years or whatever. We talked a lot about those different things and how a lot of the same type of literature exists in our culture today, just in a slightly different sense. They have, at that time, they have commentaries on the scriptures, in this case, the Old Testament, whereas we have commentaries today on the Bible. They would have predictions of end times things. Well, we still have that today. They would have mythologies. We still have that today. So we talked about a lot of those things. We're going to get back, and I believe I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago that we would get back to a different kind of different kind of group of people. And we're going to do that again. One of the reasons that I didn't do that right afterwards is because those other groups we talked about before, they all kind of started around the Maccabean revolts and right afterward, and that whole kind of scenario, whereas what we're talking about tonight, not quite the same environment, not quite the same beginning, if you will. We're talking about the Samaritans and the tax collectors. Now, as always, comments, questions, welcome. Why do you think I titled this Untouchables?
Well, it was definitely a class system.
Okay, do what? Okay, good. There's a class system, they're hated by the Jews. I'm glad you said the Jews specifically. The Samaritans aren't untouchables to each other. Neither are the Samaritans untouchables to pretty much anyone but Jews. The tax collectors certainly aren't untouchables to Romans, and we'll get into all of that in a second. The point is, we're thinking from the Jews' perspective. Most of what we've been talking about has been from the perspective of Jews who are about to have Christ come into their midst, and they're going to respond to him in a lot of different ways, most of them not good, right? And so we're trying to understand better a lot of the dynamics that are going on. So we're going to talk about these two groups tonight in hopes of not only understanding their interactions with those groups, but also Jesus' interactions with those groups. Although we won't talk super in detail about Jesus' interactions with them, I hope it at least sheds some light on all of that. So let's start off with the Samaritans. Now, Samaritans. That's an interesting word in and of itself. It's a word that we pretty much, most of us I would say at least, only associate with the New Testament. I don't know that I've really encountered anything about Samaritans anywhere except for the New Testament or people talking about the New Testament. Of course, parables like the Good Samaritan out of the New Testament, things like that. Did you know that Samaritans actually still exist? A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think, okay, well, the Jews, there's still Jewish religion, that still exists, but Samaritans, as not only a ethnic group, if we want to call them that, but specifically as a religious group, they still exist today. Now, there's not a whole lot of them, not nearly as much as practicing Jews across the world, but there are Samaritans that still exist. So let's think for just a moment about how we get Samaritans on the scene. First of all, we need to ask, were there Samaritans in the Old Testament, while Israel is still in existence? Anybody know? Do what? Okay, that's a tricky question to answer. I'm glad you put it that way. There are, I guess we could maybe say Sumerians, maybe we would call them. There were people who lived in the area of Samaria, certainly in the Old Testament. In fact, when the north and south split after King Solomon, King Rehoboam, takes over, and he's trying to be all big and bad, because he's the new king, he's going to tell everybody what's up, and the 10 tribes in the south, or the 10 tribes in the north are like, nah, we don't want any of that, right? I'm very, very Gen Z-ifying the conversation, if you notice. But the idea is you have that northern kingdom, it becomes known as Samaria because the capital was named Samaria. Just like the south became known as Judea because Judah was the main tribe, Jerusalem was the capital. So these people in the northern kingdom, they can rightly be called Samaritans, or a variant on that word in English might be Samaritans. In fact, you have that used a couple times in the Old Testament, probably referring not to what we think of as Samaritans, but probably referring to just people who lived in that area. But here's what we've got to kind of start piecing together as we think about the Samaritans. I'm not going to get crazy into the history in large part because I don't feel very confident that I know the history on this, meaning there's a lot of debate among historians about exactly how to put all these things together. So let me just share with you what we know, and then we'll go from there. We know that God allowed the northern kingdom of Israel to be taken into captivity by Assyria. So that was called Samaria, the northern kingdom. They are taken into captivity by the Assyrian Empire. We know that. That's part of the punishment for their idolatry and all these different things. Now, when they were taken, we're told a lot about this in 2 Kings 17. When they were taken away, the Assyrians, they imported other people to live in Samaria, to live in the land that the Israelites used to live in. Now, why did they do that? Well, if you remember when we talked earlier on in this class about the Assyrian captivity, the Babylonian captivity, their foreign policy, if you will, for conquered people is if we essentially export all peoples that we conquer from their homeland and put everyone, it's kind of this weird jigsaw puzzle, put everyone in a place that they're not familiar with, they won't have home field advantage to revolt. That was kind of the philosophy. That will encourage all of them not only to kind of have to deal with just getting used to a new homeland, but also encourage them to all kind of assimilate into our culture in general. That was the theory. In practice, it didn't work very well, but for the Assyrians and Babylonians, that was policy. So they take the Israelites out, the Sumerians, if you want to call them that, they take them out, they bring other people in. Now, we're told in 2 Kings chapter 17, this group of people that's imported in, they're not Jews, right? They're pagans, if we want to use that term. They worship idols. And so they start worshiping idols. But how idol worship works, in the ancient world especially, idols aren't just these kind of, how do I put this? They aren't these kind of spiritual things. They're just kind of existential, if you will. They're associated with specific places. Even you think about like Greek mythology, right? Who's, I guess I say Greek mythology. I'm going to get Greek and Roman mixed up, and I apologize for that. But who's Neptune? Is he associated with something? He's the ocean, right? Or you get someone like Hades. Who's Hades? The god of the underworld, right? They're associated with specific places. Well, when they move, when these conquered peoples who are imported into Israel, when they move into Israel, well, their first thought after a few things happen, it's funny if you read the whole chapter, I'm not going to take the time tonight, but they start thinking, we probably need to get on the good side of the God who's in control of this region, right? So they end up trying to do essentially what the Israelites before them have been trying to do. They try and worship both Yahweh and their idols. Now, as you can imagine, that's not a good situation, but at least, since these are idolaters, at least they're getting some exposure to Yahweh because they didn't know anything about God at all before this. That's what we know from Scripture. But that's the last time groups like this are really talked about. You could maybe argue some groups like this are talked about in Nehemiah and Ezra, but again, that's kind of shaky as to what we're talking about. So what happens next is really the hard question. Because, number one, if you export a people, let's just say, for example, Texas, okay? I know Texas is big, but let's just use Texas as an example. Let's even not do that. Let's look at the panhandle of Texas, just the panhandle of Texas. If you were to try and take everyone out of the panhandle of Texas and move them somewhere else, what percentage of people do you think you're actually going to manage to move out? You think we're getting 100%? That's not how that works, right? It's a very imperfect science, exporting people out of their homeland. Even if they've been conquered and they're not actively resisting, there's going to be a few of the, poorer people or country folk who, the main army garrisons don't want to bother with, that are going to be left behind. So part of the thing that's hard is even when these foreigners are imported into Israel, there were probably still some Jews left. A few, not many at all. It's certainly not predominantly Jewish anymore, but there's probably still a few Jews left. So then we have, okay, yes, they're foreigners, but also there are still some Jews probably. But then after 70 years, if you remember we talked about, Persia takes over for Babylon. They have a completely different foreign policy. We'll let people go home, they'll like us more, and also they'll be more likely, because they'll like us more, to be loyal because we're letting them live in their homeland. Well, that means not only do we know that Jews went back to Judea and built Jerusalem, like we see in Ezra and Nehemiah and other places, it's certainly possible, although we don't have any specific records of it that I'm aware of, and again, I'm showing my ignorance here, it's certainly possible some of them may have gone back to Samaria, to Israel, what we call the Northern Kingdom. Of course, it wasn't a kingdom anymore, but they might have gone back to where they, or at least their parents or grandparents were raised. It's also possible that people moved from Judea, especially during the time of the Maccabean revolt, to Samaria, especially when all that politics was going on. Remember the Civil War that happened and all those different things? So again, I'm trying not to get too much in the weeds here. The point is, by the time we get to Jesus, it's really hard to say exactly who the Samaritans are. Are they all foreigners? Are they all, and I'm using this term because this is how Jews would have talked about it, are they all half-breeds? Are they mainly Jews who have created a religious sect outside of Judea? It's really hard to tell, and you'll find a lot of conflicting evidence about this among historians. But here's what we do know. By Jesus' day, Samaritans and Jews wanted nothing to do with each other. They didn't consider each other to be of the same family. They didn't consider each other to be different sects of Jews even. They considered each other to be two separate groups that want nothing to do with each other. We see that, for example, in John 4. It's explicitly spelled out for us by John. Jews have nothing to do with Samaritans. I'm pretty sure that's an exact quote from John in verse 4, or in chapter 4, rather. They don't have anything to do with each other. Now, there's a couple reasons that we want to talk about as to why specifically. Samaritans, you might be kind of surprised to learn, they actually followed the old law, almost the exact same level as the average Jew of Jesus' day, except for one big difference. And I'm not saying there aren't other differences, but by and large, this is the big standout difference. They believed that they could prove from their copies of the law that Mount Gerizim, not Mount Zion, was supposed to be the holy mountain where you worship God. So if you remember, David, he takes Jerusalem during his kingship, and eventually he makes that where the tabernacle is brought to, or the Ark of the Covenant, rather, is brought to, and eventually Solomon builds the temple there. And this is what we're told in Kings and Chronicles. This is according to God's plan and all these things. So Mount Zion, the Temple Mount, as we sometimes call it, that's where God wants to be worshipped, and that's ultimately where the temple is constructed. Well, the Samaritans said, yeah, y'all got it all wrong. That was all political. Y'all made all that up. God always intended, especially if you look back, and they'll point back to like Deuteronomy and places like that. If you look back, there's a whole lot of significance given to Mount Gerizim, not Mount Zion. Mount Zion, at the point when the Israelites are first, and I say Deuteronomy, more like Joshua, but when they're first kind of coming into this land and everything, Mount Gerizim is given quite a bit of attention. Mount Zion hasn't been conquered yet. So they say, actually, we're going to worship where God wants people to worship, on Mount Gerizim. And this is one of the main things that kind of splits the two apart in terms of actual teaching. Now, once again, Jews, whether it's true or not, whether it's accurate or not, Jews considered Samaritans to be dirty half-breeds. That's the accusation, however much truth it may or may not have had in terms of actual biology and ethnicity and ancestry and so forth. But in terms of their religious practices, there is a big difference here. And I think that we can make an argument that at the very least, there was a real difference between the two groups. You remember, I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So in John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. If you remember that conversation is recorded. And something the Samaritan woman says to him, she says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Now it's interesting because she is making this distinction, right? She's saying, we believe we should worship on this mountain, you believe you should worship on that mountain. And ultimately, if you look at the context, she's kind of trying to change the subject from what Jesus has just been talking about, trying to kind of trip him up and let's go a different direction. But Jesus responds, in part, he says, salvation is of the Jews, and implies that not only is it right to worship at Mount Zion, but that Jews and Samaritans are rightly being distinguished in this sense. So it is interesting to kind of look at that. But the main thing that I want us to understand here from this kind of overview is that the Jews, however much truth there was or not, from the Jewish perspective, Samaritans are irredeemably tainted foreigners. They can't be made right. Now think about this. Isn't that interesting? Because can Gentiles become Jews? I'm not talking about ethnically speaking. They can become proselytes, right? Even we have in the New Testament in particular, there's some proselyte Jews that become very prominent in the New Testament, as well as we see that take place in the Old Testament. Based on at least what I've read, and you know, if y'all are familiar with some evidence to the contrary, that's not even on the radar for a Jew. Samaritans aren't even eligible to become proselytes in their minds. They're that far gone. At least that's the way they were treated. They're foreigners, they're half-breeds, they're irredeemable, to put quite frankly, to use a term that was used sometimes, they're dogs, right? That they're lower than human, essentially, is how they were treated. That gives us a little bit of insight into what a statement it is for Jesus to, for example, go up to a well in Samaria and talk to a Samaritan woman. Because we have this dynamic where, if we can be just logical about this for a second, the Samaritans are wrong on some things from a religious standpoint, and if it is true that they are in fact half-breeds, and again, I'm using that term because that's how it would be used, if they are only part Jew and their ancestry isn't pure, that means that there's some issues with the old law in terms of uncleanness and things like that. If that's the case, well, that's legitimate, but that doesn't justify treating anyone as subhuman. That's not a part of the law at all, right? So we can see this evolution in the mind of the Jews from, we need to follow the law, these people have some things that they're not following about the law, we can't accept that, to these people themselves are just irredeemable and can't be tolerated, have to be treated as subhuman. So now let's talk about the other group for a few minutes tonight. Tax collectors. Now once again, we're talking about a group that Jesus was very familiar with. In fact, one of his inner circle is, guess what? A tax collector, or a former tax collector anyway. We also have the story of Zacchaeus, who was called a tax collector. Now, in our experience, what comes to mind when you hear the word tax collector, or just taxes? Okay, big government, good. The IRS, right? Now, who does the IRS collect taxes for? Which government? It's ours, right? There's a difference, though. Because for us, we're thinking of taxes for our own government. Now listen, we may not like it, right? We may not think that it's appropriate. We may not think the amounts or the uses or all these different things, the tactics that are used, there's all sorts of opinions about that. I get that. But it is for our own government. At the very least, we can say that that money is being collected so that, at least nominally, right, they say, so that our government can function. When we use the word tax collector in the Bible, Because this is kind of our mindset, I'm pointing like you can see this one. Since this is kind of our mindset, that creates an issue. Because in fact, the Jews weren't collecting money for their own government. In reality, what we call tax collectors, these Jewish tax collectors, it's really probably better to call them something like revenue agents, or even maybe something like tribute agents. They're collecting tribute from the Jews, from one group of people, for a whole other government, specifically the Roman government that occupies them. That's not taxes in the sense that we think of taxes. I mean, you want to talk about the founding of our country, we're talking about taxation without representation. Well, at least the British were basically our countrymen at that point. Imagine if you're talking about taxation without representation by a wholly foreign government. I'm saying wholly like the whole thing, like completely foreign. You better believe there would have been a revolution then, right? That's the case for the Jews with this system that's in place. These are revenue agents collecting tribute to give to a completely different government. That's not going to Jewish, whatever we want to talk about taxes, Jewish infrastructure, Jewish schools. It's not going to fund Jewish military to protect them. It's not going to any of that. It's all going back to Rome to fill the pockets of the emperor and the Senate and all these people who Jews really don't want anything to do with anyway, right? So you can imagine that it's not very popular to have to pay this tax. But it gets worse. Now, I'm not trying to be insensitive by using this example, but I think it's a very appropriate example. We're probably familiar with some of the dynamics of the Holocaust in terms of concentration camps, in terms of, you would have the German guards, you would have the prisoners, they would be forced to work, robbed and be executed, all these things. But something you may or may not be familiar with is that within this system, at least in most camps, as far as I'm aware, in most of the concentration camps, or death camps even as they were often called, rightly so, there weren't just Germans in charge. A lot of times, they would also take some of the prisoners and convince them to be overseers over the other prisoners. And they would kind of be bribed into this sometimes by extra rations or better treatment or things like that. Maybe an assurance they wouldn't be the first ones going to the gas chambers. Again, not trying to be insensitive. But that's the kind of dynamic that existed. Now, if you talk to or read some of the stuff, I say talk to, a lot of those people have passed on now, but if you read some of the accounts of this, especially some of the eyewitness accounts of people who were there, oh yeah, the Jews hated the Germans who were doing this to them. But you want to know who they hated more? The ones who agreed to be overseers in those camps. Now, obviously, very different time, very different setting, very different events going on. But if you think about that kind of dynamic between a Jewish prisoner in a concentration camp and a Jewish overseer who is overseeing that prisoner and treating them harshly and working for the Germans, think about how much hatred the Jewish prisoners in general would have for their Jewish overseers, and maybe you have a picture of the mindset towards the tax collectors in Jesus' time. Again, I understand different setting, I understand people are being executed, at least not in the same way, but that's pretty much the dynamic. These are not only just people who are doing something that we don't like or enabling something we don't like, these are traitors. In fact, you want to talk about one of the prime targets for someone like the Sicarii that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago, going into the crowds and stabbing somebody in the back. You better believe that someone like a tax collector would be right up on top of that list, right? Because they would consider them traitors. Not only that, though, another aspect of the tax collection system, and I'm using that because that's the term we're familiar with. Like I said, revenue agent is probably a better word. But the way this is set up is actually quite simple and, from a political standpoint, quite genius, but also pretty dark at the same time. Tax collectors, basically, under the Roman system, Rome says, hey, you need to collect this much. Don't care how you do it, you're going to have the garrison at your disposal. You can force people to pay up however much you want. By the way, it wasn't like us where each person has to pay a certain percentage. A lot of times they just stop people on the road. So some people might have to pay at 3 different booths depending on where they ended up at, and that's just tough luck. So it's not fair, number one, but also because it's set up this way where the tax collector just has to give a certain amount to Rome, Rome basically said, you make your own salary, and once you give us our cut, you keep whatever's left for the year or whatever period of time that they would do it for. Well, if you're already hated by everyone around you, except for the other tax collectors, I guess, you think they're going to settle for minimum wage? No, they're going to take as much as they can get. They're going to fleece the people, not just to give Rome their due, but to fill their own pockets. If we can't be liked by people, at least we can be liked for the money that we have, to the degree that we can make ourselves comfortable and maybe get in with some of the Gentiles in the area or something like that. And so ultimately, not only are they considered traitors on a very deep-seated level among the Jews, but these tax collectors are also getting rich off of the Jews. They're abusing in every possible way their power. And so, yeah, you better believe that makes them even less popular in this degree. Now, could we say every single tax collector was abusing their power to the extent that their reputation maintained? Probably not. There were probably some who were more reasonable with what kind of a cut they took for themselves. But the bottom line is, number one, most of them are going to take advantage of the system, because why wouldn't you? I'm not saying morally why wouldn't you, but just pragmatically, that's going to be the temptation. But number two, I mean, we see that in the records, even of some of the tax collectors that Jesus himself talks to. So ultimately, you have the irredeemably corrupt foreigners and half-breeds, but tax collectors were the other group. They're also not just untouchables, not just hated, they're irredeemable. They're irredeemable, though, because they're corrupt and because they're traitors. So both of these groups are considered beyond saving. Now, we talk a lot in Christianity. Now, whether we put it into practice is another thing, right? But we talk a lot in Christianity about no one being a lost cause. Everyone, as long as you have breath, you have the ability to obey the gospel, to be right with God, to make your life right, to repent. Which means, as Christians, we should never give up on anyone or say anyone's, beyond help. That doesn't mean we cast our pearls before swine. That means we always are hoping and praying for every single person, no matter how, far gone maybe we should say, they seem to be in a life of sin. We're always hoping that they will come back, and we always want to be ready to welcome them if they do come back, no matter how much society may classify them as a low-class citizen or whatever. But for the Jews, that's not a thing, at least not for these two groups. Samaritans and tax collectors are beyond hope. They are irredeemable. There's not a coming back for them, which is why, going back to things like the Good Samaritan, which is why it's so powerful that the one person in the whole story who Jews would consider not capable of being in a right relationship with God or coming back from the kind of person that they are is the hero of the story. Or why Zacchaeus is the one that Jesus chooses to go and eat with. And by the way, remember, Zacchaeus, not just a traitor, as the Jews would call him, but also admits in that meal when Jesus eats with them that he has defrauded people, that he has acted corruptly in his office. So what do we have as we wrap up for this evening? I want us to notice something that's very important here. Jesus did not disagree with the accusations of the Jews that Samaritans were incorrect about where to worship and things like that. He didn't disagree that corruption among the tax collectors was wrong. He never said anything about those things. In fact, he tells the Samaritan woman at the well, no, you're wrong about where to worship. He tells Zacchaeus, yeah, you need to make things right. You need to not defraud people. He doesn't disagree on those things. What's he disagree on? He disagreed that they were irredeemable. That's the standout difference between Jesus and the rest of the Jews of his day. The Jews saw people who were beyond saving. Jesus saw people who needed saving more than anyone. which is why when he's there eating with the tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees say, "What on earth are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" He says, "The ones who are sick are the ones who need the physician." Now, does the physician go to the house to treat someone if they're sick or if they're dead? Well, if they're dead, you call the mortician, right? You don't call the doctor. The Jews thought they were already dead. In their eyes, they're as good as dead from a spiritual standpoint. Jesus says, no, they're sick. They can come back. Just like, remember, even with dead people in Jesus' case, he sees the girl, for example, who has died and says she's just fallen asleep. Well, she was biologically dead. He's saying she can be brought back. That's what he was saying with the tax collectors, the sinners, the Samaritans, people who are considered irredeemable. He says, no, they can be brought back. And I'm going to invest in them because, as he tells the Pharisees, and I'm paraphrasing the point he makes, but essentially he says, I can help them. They know they need help. You think you're fine, so I can't really help you. So I hope that gives us a little bit more of a picture of these two groups and of why not only the Jews responded to them the way they did, but why they responded to Jesus interacting with them the way that they did. This is not something any self-respecting Jew would do, is interact with a Samaritan or a tax collector. But Jesus did both because he believed they had hope of being saved. And that's a message for us as well. Any last comments or thoughts before we close? As always, thank you all so much for listening, and I appreciate that. Like I said, we're going to go through a couple more of these or so, and then I have something else that I'm really excited for us to get into and study for a while, so I'm looking forward to that as well. But I hope these things are helpful. As always, we do want to offer the invitation. If there is anything we can do to help you, pray for you, the Lord's invitation is always open, so please let us know as we stand and sing.
Years I spent in vanity
And pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to men.